I have been in the museum world my whole adult life, and 2 months ago, I had by far the most emotional experience I've ever had in a museum. It was in this place. It's the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia. And I walked in not really expecting very much. I was with a bunch of other nonprofit executives, and all of us were transformed by this place. And in particular, this experience that you're looking at was transformative. And so here's what happens. You go and you sit down in one of these lunchroom diner chairs that is a model of what it was like in the early 1960s in Atlanta. These are the same lunchroom chairs, or ones very much like them, that young black activists sat in when they went into a whites-only luncheon diner. And you go and you sit down in this chair and you put on headphones, and a voice talks in your ear and says, "Put your hands in the handprints in front of you." So you do that, and the voice continues, and it says, "You're about to experience what it was like to be an African-American activist in 1963 in a lunchroom diner for whites only. Try and keep your hands on the spot. If you lift them, the voice will stop." And then this voice of a man starts in your ear, and I have no idea how they did it, but you can feel the man's breath in your ear, and he is saying horrendous things. He is saying things like, and I can't even remember exactly, but it was like, "I'm going to take this fork and I'm going to stick it in your neck and I'm going to watch you bleed out," and things of that nature. The experience lasts 1.5 minutes. Most people don't make it. By the time it's over and you take your hands off, almost everybody is in tears. And there is a woman who works at the center who's standing there with a box of tissues and will give you a hug if you want one. And for me, the experience was particularly powerful because my wife is African American, my daughter is African American. Back in 1963, when I was alive, it would have been illegal for my wife and I to be intimate, let alone to be married. And because of these young black youths, we can be together today. And what hit me more than has ever hit me before is that these 20-something black kids had no clue if they would be successful in trying to transform the world. They didn't know. It's easy to, in retrospect, to look back and say, "Oh, of course it was going to be successful." They didn't know. They took the risk. And I walked away thinking about injustice and thinking about making a difference in the world, and I started to think more and more about the Children in Nature movement. What is the injustice that we're fighting, and how might we fight it? So I went back and I started doing more research, and I've been thinking about this for years, but I started doing more research on social movements. So today, I'd like to do a couple of things. I want to talk about social movements in general and what a successful movement consists of. And then I want to turn to the Children in Nature movement, or as I'm referring it here, following the lead of Richard Louv, the New Nature movement, because it isn't just children, it's adults too. And I'm going to be a little bit provocative, and I hope you'll forgive me in that. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what each of you can do if what I'm saying makes any sense to you at all. So social movements in general have a number of things in common, almost all of them that are successful on any kind of a large scale. They tend to be in opposition to something. They tend to be fighting some kind of injustice, some social injustice. So we might ask ourselves, in the New Nature movement, what are we in opposition to? Social movements tend to have precipitating events. Think about Rosa Parks getting on a bus in 1955 and refusing to move when a white person said she needed to stand up because the whites-only section was full. What's the precipitating event or events for the New Nature movement? Movements tend to have charismatic leaders. Richard Louv has admirably served the role for this movement for a long time. And we need more leaders. In particular, we need young leaders. We need leaders of color. We need women leaders, or young women of color leaders. Whatever it is, that is key for us moving forward. And that experience in Atlanta reinforced to me that most social movements are undertaken by young people, people in their 20s. Of course, Martin Luther King was only 33 when he gave his I Have a Dream speech in Washington. It's young people who are doing a lot of this work. So we might ask ourselves, how might we engage a much broader audience of youth, of millennials? And it's important for us to keep in mind that social movements have life cycles. They are born, they grow as they build coalitions, they do real work of one form or another, and they die, whether they're successful or not. So we have to remember that this movement, the New Nature movement, will die one way or the other, and we have to work to make sure that it's successful in a reasonable length of time. But as I was surveying the literature about social movements and trying to wrap my head around it, three things came to the surface that all successful movements have. And they actually follow a chronologic order of sorts, which is pretty neat. The first, and arguably most important, because it's what kicks things off, is vision. Without a successful vision, almost any movement is doomed from the start. Many people criticize the Occupy movement because it was in opposition to something but wasn't very clear on what it was for. What was the North Star it was heading towards? And in contrast, Martin Luther King taught us that no movement can be successful unless it provides a vision that people want to move towards. And in Washington and other speeches, of course, he took the civil rights movement and he reframed it and brought it to another level, which brought in global attention. And what he did was he made sure that he tapped into the moral conscience of a nation and even the world by saying that this isn't about equal rights for African Americans. This is about equal rights, period, for everybody. And if we don't have this in the United States, he was saying, then what does that say about us? It's in our Constitution, but we're not living it. And by saying that, he reframed the problem so that now it was clearly not just a Southern problem or a black problem. It became everybody's problem. So vision is key, and I'd like us to think about what our vision should be, and I'll come back to that. The second key element after vision that sort of comes naturally as the next step is coalition building. And in coalition building, it's really important to think about who are the people who are your active supporters. I'll do it from this side. Who are your active supporters, passive supporters, who are neutral, who are your passive, people who are passive objectors to what you're doing, and people who actively object to what your movement is. And the key is to start at the end where you're building your tribe of people that really are already there with you, and then work your way across. And once you get to the people who passively object and you start converting them, you know you're starting to work towards victory. So we have to ask ourselves, who's on this spectrum? And of course, this depends on how you frame your vision. And the third and the final element in building a successful social movement really comes down to collaboration. And some people call it organizing, and it's very closely related, but this is the work of the movement. Standing in protest, doing marches is important, and it's critical work, and it's not enough. You have to have clear goals. You have to be trying to change legislation. You have to be trying to do something that is clear-cut, that people can understand, that is time-bound, that you can work towards. So, once again, who's our coalition? What are we collaborating for? What's success look like for us in the near term and the long term? So, let me go then to the new nature movement. Why is this important? Well, clearly, you're all here because you believe it is. But I'll bet you believe it's important for different reasons, as it should be. Now, you've all heard the scary statistics that the average American child, at least, and it's almost certainly extendable to North America, spends on the order of 7 to 10 hours a day looking at screens, and on the order of minutes, 7 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is, outdoors in nature. And I often get together with groups like this when I'm talking about this topic, and I say, think about a place from your childhood, the most meaningful place from your childhood. And you're a biased group, so I'm not going to do this. Because after I say that and I ask them to envision it and who was there and what are you doing, I say, okay, how many people have a place that's outside? It doesn't matter what the audience is. It's well over 90%. It's often 100% of people say that. And then I invite them to imagine a generation from now, somebody standing on the same stage asking the same question and having it reversed, where only 5% of the kids or 5% of the adults put their hands up. That's what we're heading towards. Rich talked to us about the last child in the woods. We are the last generation in the woods. We're the last ones that can remember what it's like to deeply connect with nature. And if we get old and disappear, there isn't going to be a generation after us that's really pushing it, because people are going to say, what's this nature thing anyway? And of course, with kids today, we have runaway rates that are getting lower and lower in age, of obesity, attention deficit disorder, diabetes, depression, even conditions like myopia, to the point where one U.S. Surgeon General said that this generation of kids may be the first in history, at least recorded history, to have a life expectancy shorter than that of their parents. Okay, well, that's a pretty good reason, right, for doing a new nature movement. But that's half the argument for some people. The other half relates to the other side of the human-nature relationship. And the argument here is, go ask 100 scientists what are the most pressing issues of our time, and you will hear about global warming, species extinctions, habitat destruction, all true. And as a scientist, I would back them all up 100%. And I would say that unless you connect kids with nature, you can't solve those other big things. Because those big issues require that people make decisions about the natural world. And if you don't engage in the natural world, if you have no emotional connection, let alone an intellectual one, why are you going to make decisions in favor of nature? So, arguably, sustainability, at least ecological sustainability, demands that we connect people with nature. So it's the two sides of the human nature coin. Stephen Jay Gould, who I had the pleasure of knowing, is an evolutionary biologist, and in a very uncharacteristic statement for Gould once said, he was not a guy to talk about emotions very often, but he said, "We cannot win this battle to save species and environments without forming an emotional bond between ourselves and nature, for we will not fight to save what we do not love." Profound words. So we need both sides, the human side and the nature side, and I would argue that is the new nature movement, that both sides need to do. So whatever vision we have, I think needs to encompass both. Well, then there's the question of what is nature connection and how do we do it? I spent a couple of years writing a book on this topic, and I basically now bring it down to 3 key elements. They spell out the acronym NEW to make it easy to remember, and I talk about giving kids new eyes with which to see the world. And the first letter, the N in NEW, is simply to notice nature. Most kids, most adults, no longer even notice the natural world. We step outside the front door and we go and we get into our vehicles and we don't even look and see what the day is like. So I always encourage people, stop. We can all afford 10 seconds and just breathe and notice the day. Like, what's the weather? What does the air feel like? How many different kinds of birds can you hear? Are there buds coming out? Whatever it is, if it's rain, snow, whatever, just experience it. And if you do that, kids will pick up on that value and they will start to do it too. Kids won't value nature unless we do. So the first part of this nature connection is simply to notice it. We need this on a broad scale. And not just the little things like insects, but the big things like the sky. And of course, if you want to blow away a kid, just take them out walking at night. The second letter, the E, is engage. Kids need to bodily engage with nature. Nature connection is a full contact sport. And both kids and nature can take it. I'm not saying that we need to let, herds of kids run wild in all our national parks, although I might actually support that. But we should at least put aside an area of these parks for kids to go crazy, for them to climb trees, to throw rocks and sticks, to dig in the mud, to pick up flowers. All of you, I'm willing to bet, that feel this connection to the natural world did not spend your life in nature staying on the trail, right? You got out there and you got dirty. Nature connection is about getting dirty, and we're not allowing it to happen. We have all these fears now about letting kids even climb a tree. How many of you climbed trees when you were kids? Right, and you lived to tell the story, right? So why are we so nervous about letting kids do stuff like that today? We need to rethink the notion of risk and ask ourselves, what's the risk of not letting a kid climb a tree? When kids get to be teenagers, they're going to take risks. Their brains are wired for them to take risks. And if they've never dealt with it before, guess what? They're going to be lousy at dealing with risks. And at that point, it may involve drugs and alcohol and all kinds of stuff. So you want them to be taking risks as kids. And there's a lot of evidence now to show that in many societies, particularly hunter-gatherer societies, kids, really young kids, are playing with fire and knives and all these things. They learn how to navigate risk, so by the time they're into adolescence, they know how to deal with it. So engaging is key. And of course, what engages kids changes with age. A kid in middle childhood from 6 to about 10 or 11 isn't just about playing, they're about demonstrating their competence, their ability to do things like fishing or whatever. So you have to find activities that allow them to do that. And then finally, the W in new engages the mind and its wonder. We need to be purveyors of wonder. Every child, pretty much, is born with a sense of wonder, and in effect, we beat it out of them by the time they're 9 or 10. So we need to help keep that wonder alive. And it turns out there's lots of ways of doing it, and one of the ways not to do it is to answer all kids' questions with answers. Don't do it. It's so tempting. I'm a biologist, and some of you maybe heard me tell this story before. My daughter Jade, when she was about 8 years old, we were walking up a hill and we saw a great blue heron, and I love great blue herons, arguably my favorite bird. We were in Northern California, and Jade said, "Daddy, what's that bird?" And every little fiber in my being wanted to say, "That's a great blue heron, and the scientific name is blah, blah, blah," and show that I knew all this stuff. And trust me, on many occasions I have done just that. On this day, my wisdom kicked in and I said, "I don't know. What kind of bird do you think it is?" She said, "I think it might be a heron." I said, "Well, why don't we just sit here and watch it for a bit?" And we did. And I said, "What do you think it's doing?" And she said, "I think it's hunting." And I said, "Wow, what do you think it's hunting for?" She said, "Rodents." I went, "Cool." So we watched this great blue heron in this field, and it does the classic great blue heron thing where it does the slow Zen-like bow, and then at the last second jams its beak into the ground and comes up with a rodent, and then tips its beak up, puts the rodent down, and you can watch this mole, go down the gullet of this bird. And Jade is going, "Cool, this is amazing," right? So we sat there for like 20 minutes and watched this heron deplete the field of rodents. And we're walking up the hill, and Jade's talking about it, and we get home, and the very first thing she does is go open a bird book and come running to me and say, "Daddy, that was a great blue heron. Wasn't that amazing?" And to this day, she still remembers and talks about that, and she's 14 now. Now, here's the other scenario. She said, "Daddy, what's that bird?" And I say, "Oh, it's a great blue heron, and the scientific name is blah, blah, blah." And then we keep going up the hill, and the learning opportunity is lost. So, remember, questions are more powerful than answers. Really key. And when kids come in from being outdoors, ask them questions about their experience. Get them to tell the story, and you can turn what might be otherwise an everyday experience into something profound they will remember for a long time. And then the other way that we can be purveyors of wonder is to give kids experiences and tell stories. So, kids don't eat vegetables, have them grow their vegetables in a garden, and most kids will eat them. So you have the bodily experience and you tie that in with the knowledge of watching food come from dirt. That's a powerful experience that can promote that sense of wonder. Really important. So 3 things. Notice, engage, and wonder. The cool part is it's free, and it doesn't matter where you start. You can start with any one of these and go to any other. Doesn't matter. But it's 3 elements that are at the core, I think, of nature connection. And really, it's all about mentors and time outdoors. So there was a great study done by a friend of mine who said, two things to build a strong nature connection: abundant time in wild or semi-wild places, and abundant time therefore means almost certainly close to home, and a mentor to share in the experience. So this is what we need to scale, all right? This is nature connection. We need to have mentors getting kids outside. As they say, the best way to get kids outside is to take them there. So that's what we need to do. Okay. This is what I've written about in